All right. I want to thank you all for coming to today's session. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the second in a three-part online series of workshops that focus on universal design for learning. The workshop will focus today on multiple means of representation. Now, the first workshop was conducted last month by my colleague, Yvonne Johnson, focused on multiple means of engagement. And a third session will be conducted in April, and it will focus on multiple means of action and expression. Next slide. My name is Dan Cabrera, and I'm the Multimedia Coordinator of the Faculty Development and Instructional Design Center at NIU. Just to make sure that you know it's really me, I'm going to turn on my my webcam. Hey, everybody. I figured we might as well use this since we will be talking about the use of video in today's session. Hello, Yuan. However, I'm not very vain, so I'm going to turn off mine. Not to say that people who have it on continuously are vain people. It's just not, it's not something that I do all the time. All right, next slide. All right, I want to just go over the agenda today. It's actually kind of a list of objectives, but it's not really in the objective format, but just to let you know that I know the distinction. Today, I'm going to have a very brief overview of the Universal Design for Learning framework. I remember I had sent out an email reminder about today's session, and I asked people who hadn't been to the first session to, if they had time, to look at the recording of that session. And then that session, my colleague Yvonne does an excellent job of reviewing, doing an overview of universal design, and it's important to really understand coming in. And I will do a little bit of that. However, I'm going to rely on that first presentation for you to get a good idea of what it is. You can ask questions at any time if you need some clarification. But my focus today is really on, as I mentioned earlier, looking at multiple means of representation. And we'll be looking at this sort of a neural network or a recognition network. I'll be explaining that in just a few minutes. Since I am focusing on multiple means of representation, we're going to be taking a much closer look at that. In the previous session, Yvonne talked about multiple means of engagement, so we're focusing on a new area today. And I'll also be providing tips and strategies for offering alternative forms of information to encourage engagement and support understanding. Now, just want to make a point here. Although we're talking about representation, and I've mentioned that there's also multiple means of engagement as well as action and expression. Some of these areas are arbitrarily split up because, you know, when you have material that's engaging because of its of how you create it, how you present it, that actually, you know, fits right in with something. If you have material that's very boring, it's not going to be engaging with them at all. So we're just sort of artificially separating. Although the folks who've designed UDL, Universal Design for Learning, understand this as well, and they've made the separation, but with the understanding that a lot of these things are related to each other. Next slide, please. So Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, is a framework for making learning more inclusive. It means keeping everybody in mind when you design something. So you're promoting inclusion. There's a particular organization that is fundamental in promoting UDL. It is a Center for Applied Special Technology, CAST, and it sums this idea of UDL with their own special mantra: teach every student. Okay, so while some people associate UDL with accommodating students that happen to have disabilities, it really means every student. So to provide a bit of background and foundational information, let's discuss a little bit more about UDL. UDL design principles can be applied to overall design of instruction as well as specific instructional materials, facilities, and strategies, such as lectures, classroom discussions, group work, web-based instructions, labs, field work, and demonstrations. Universally designed curriculum provides students with a wide range of abilities or disabilities um, with ethnic backgrounds, language skills, and learning skills, learning styles, really requires multiple means of representation, expression, and engagement. Next slide. So we're talking about something that benefits everyone. So CAST has done extensive work in the area of universal design for learning. And I'm going to share the URLs, the URL and resources, other resources with you individuals in the workshop when I send up a follow-up email later this week. So the CAST Center has many resources and tools for instructors that are interested in implementing UDL in the course or in the courses or a specific curriculum. Now, I want to acknowledge their contribution. I heavily borrowed from their materials in developing our own my workshop. But I want to acknowledge them and also have others that I will acknowledge at the end of my presentation. There's a lot of great material on UDL out there. Next slide, please. Can I ask you to go back just one? I'm sorry, I think I might have advanced. Thank you. So UDL provides a framework to create and implement lessons with flexible goals, methods, materials, and assessments that support learning for all students. Next slide. So learning happens in an interaction between an individual and the environment, or the transaction between these two things. So it's both social and it's contextual. And for that reason, it's very important to understand how a person's knowledge shifts and changes as they interact with the environment. Now, a single class may include students who struggle to learn for any number of reasons. All right, I'm going to ask you folks, what are some reasons why people might struggle in your classroom? Okay, taking your class. And so I'd like to ask you to put something in the chat area. What are some characteristics or attributes of students that might hinder instruction or learning, I should say? Yep, underprepared. When you ask people to read and they don't, technical jargon or what do they call it? Professional jargon or argot. Limited requisite knowledge, disability. Excellent. These are all very, very valid characteristics that might keep students from knowing that. And Leslie says they don't have the prerequisite knowledge. That is excellent. And in fact, that's part of UDL too, is that people build on an understanding of content based on previous knowledge. Oh, tired after working all day. This is a very good one. Thank you, Damien. What happens is that people now increasingly are non-traditional students. They're working all day long, and they come and they may be taking courses either face-to-face, but more likely online instruction. And they just may not have the wherewithal to be able to do that, especially if it's a live session. However, for those individuals who are presenting in a synchronous session like we're doing right now, fortunately, it can be recorded. And so people can go back and listen to what happened and ask questions of the faculty member if they have an online session, an online office hour. Great. So I just want to sort of emphasize those areas that might cause people to struggle. Learning disabilities, that's what's been said before. Learning and physical disabilities, the English language barriers, cultural barriers or customs, maybe even emotional or behavioral problems, or maybe even limited access to and experience with using technology. These are all valid reasons why people might struggle, and we try to overcome them. Next slide. Okay. Let's see. To help instructors build courses that include flexibility in terms of educational goals and materials, CAST has a number of tools on their website. Oh, I think I've already mentioned that already. Okay, fine. So let's break down the term universal design for learning. All right, universal. When we talk about universal, we're talking about all backgrounds, people of varying degrees of strengths with different needs and different interests. Okay, so we're carrying, or we are covering all of these differences. Curriculum really needs to provide learning opportunities for each and every student, despite their background, strengths, needs, and interests. Next slide. All right, universal for learning. When we talk about learning, we're talking about neuroscience. And neuroscience, what it tells us is that our brains have three broad networks. Next slide. So let's move into an overview of the Universal Design for Learning framework regarding neuroscience. There is the affective network. It connects with the stimulation of a learner's interest and motivation for learning. Why do they want to learn? This is multiple means of engagement. The recognition network, which is we're going to be focusing on today, really relates to presentation of information and content in alternative or in different ways. What the students see, what they hear, what they read. What are they learning? Okay, so once again, that's multiple means of representation. And lastly, the strategic network, which relates to a differentiation of ways that students can provide evidence of what they've learned. Also includes planning and organizing to solve problems or complete tasks. How are they learning? Multiple means of action and expression. Next slide. So this is just presenting it the same information in a slightly different way. So we'll still see affective, okay, and that's how learners get engaged and how they stay motivated, how they're challenged or how they're interested. Compared with recognition, which is how learners gather facts and categorize what they see, hear, and read. And finally, strategic, which is how learners plan and perform their tasks, organization, and expression of ideas. I want to ask you guys, now you don't have to answer, this is a rhetorical question, but how many of you think about why students are learning or what they're learning and how they'll demonstrate what they're learning in their courses? I'm sure all of us do. This is a rhetorical question because I'm sure all of us have had that experience. Next slide, please. We'll be focusing on, as I mentioned before, recognition. Okay. So now what neuroscience tells us about our brains regarding the recognition network, this is the what of learning. Okay, next slide, please. And what I want to do is I want to give you sort of an example of how you present information. This may appear to be kind of a wild configuration of a lot of different images too. But this is, I guess I would call it kind of a conceptual map or a mind map regarding universal design. Next slide. Okay. So the first principle, multiple means of representation. Oh, can we go back? Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. It allows us to take a step back and think, now how can I present? How can I represent what I'm teaching to my class so that it meets the needs of everyone, including students who have a visual or auditory impairment? And by doing that, you come up with maybe different ideas, different ways to represent, and that actually can benefit the entire classroom. Next slide. Multiple means of engagement, which we talked about last month. Next slide. And multiple means of action and expression. And so if you look at all three, next slide, you'll see that they're all supportive of each other. You even have directional flow here and different components. And I don't want you to spend too much time on this particular thing, but it's a image that's meant to have individuals look at, reflect on, and maybe ask questions later on. And it will become more meaningful after we've discussed different components of, well, today's session with multiple means of representation. But it's an easy enough image that it takes complex ideas and puts them in an area that's a little bit more easy to understand. This is a kind of a busy mind map, I grant you. And I'll give you some examples of other infographics that actually do the same thing. Next slide. Okay. So in asking the question how you would make instructional materials appeal to diverse students, and I think we already talked about a single class may include not just the average students, which is pretty much what a lot of instructional materials are focused on, the average students. There's a lot of possible ways in which students might not be receptive to information if it's presented in only a single way. We're talking about, once again, learning disabilities, sensory and physical disabilities, English language barriers, cultural barriers, or customs. I've already mentioned those previously. Next slide. So individuals who and there were a number of individuals who developed or created the UDL framework. They were really trying to take the best practices at the time, using strong research based in neurology and education and in technology, and come up with different ways to think about supporting all learners. So many learners learn better when, it turns out, when you use multiple senses at the same time, of course, within reason. Since students are diverse, then it only makes sense to present materials in different ways. We see all experience learning in a different manner, perhaps different mechanisms or outlets, and they definitely process information differently. And you can't have the same mechanism for all learners who are not receptive to those other ways of doing that. So by addressing all different modalities, visual, auditory, and text, we're more likely to engage our learners. This is sort of the crossover between multiple means of engagement and multiple means of representation. Now, the consequences of not doing this is that the teachers themselves can act as a barrier for students from processing the same information, and it can lead to frustration. Now, when we take this issue and teach online, it may have require us to use even different techniques to be able to reach those students. Next slide. So with multiple means of representation, you can help to ensure engagement for everyone. You can provide options for processing information. You can make connections, and you can see big ideas and build conceptual models of understanding. You can use multimedia and digital access in order to change the communication landscape. So you're presenting content in multiple ways. And so UDL really asks us to consider options for representations. And not only students, but also faculty and instructors and teachers also benefit from using this as well. They start thinking differently. Next slide. So what are some of the ways in which we might make materials more appealing to a diverse range of students? Well, we might provide options for perception, different options for perceptions. So we use technology to provide access to information that otherwise we're creating a barrier to learning. So by designing content from the beginning rather than having to retrofit, going back afterwards and trying to change it, it makes it much easier for us. So we need to pay attention to basic accessibility issues. For instance, in using any visual aids like an image, we might also want to include a text alternative. Okay. So addressing the variability, which is the norm and standard and not the exception with students. So by addressing variability with students' access and processing information really requires us to address the needs for those individuals who may be in the margins with those disability attributes. You might want to need to provide 2 or more ways to access information, which is an important part of UDL, the UDL environment. Next slide. So we're providing guidelines. Oops, back please. Providing guidelines for comprehension. So we're promoting understanding and making deeper connections with that information. We're allowing our students to do that. So what students do with the facts and how they solve problems with them, make connections between them or combine them into something new, these are important skills that they need now and also for the future. Now, it turns out that visual thinking helps students to generalize and retain information better. So I'd like you to consider creating visual maps like the one I had initially showed you. They're also known as concept maps or mind maps, in order to show learners how their knowledge grows and interconnections over the course of a unit of study. And I'm going to give some examples of that later on. So that these visual techniques are a key way to highlight patterns, to define critical features, and to show relationships. And I'd like to use as an example for my own area, public health, the story of John Snow and the Broad Street Pump. It was actually Dr. John Snow. He was an obstetrician. Is considered the father of modern day epidemiology. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to attempt to share this. Okay. Okay. Oh, hold on there. All right, great. So this is a website. This is a website that actually talks about John Snow. In fact, it's probably from somebody that I know. It's a UCLA Department of Epidemiology School of Public Health that actually, in a colorful way, describes what happened. It's the story. It says British doctor John Snow couldn't convince other doctors and scientists that cholera, a deadly and infectious disease, it was spread when people drank contaminated water, until a mother washed her baby's diapers in a town well in 1854 and touched off an epidemic that killed 616 people. So there's actually a story involved. It's not just presenting information, but it's how it's presenting to engage the learner. But as I scroll down here, he also includes, in addition to the text that describes this stuff in a very engaging manner, the use of imagery to actually involve or invest the students who are reading this. Even talking about the new concept of airborne transmission of disease, vector-borne transmission of disease. It's really very fascinating. Okay. Let's see. Now I'm going to stop the sharing. Going to go back to my slide. Going to try to get back to the slide that I need to be in. That is okay. So public health, and in order to enhance the interest of the student, actually you might want to engage by using images that actually can convey the severity of the problem. Right here, I just have a particular image of children and other individuals who are consuming water from this well that has been infected. This happened to be on Broad Street. It was in Soho, which is a suburb of London. And you can see here that we have an image, kind of a frightening image of what looks like death, pumping the water for the students, for the individuals who are consuming that. Next slide, please. Now, what was really fascinating is that John Snow was able to determine a pattern of activity that suggested to him that there was something other than, I believe at the time of the day, the idea was that disease was transmitted through vapors, and actually airborne transmission is one mechanism. But in this particular case, that wasn't the case. Okay, it was waterborne. Next slide. And Dr. Snow realized that a lot of these cases, you can see as referenced here with these are simply the number of cases. You can see in this one household, we have multiple cases here, but you can see that they're around the location of the pump. And this is how I look at epidemiologists too. They really are detectives. I consider them to be the studs of public health. They really go out and do a lot of the groundwork that actually is responsible for identifying epidemics, the source of the epidemics, the spread of the epidemics, and to recommend surveillance as a mechanism for sort of controlling the spread of disease. Okay, great. Next slide. So in order to be able to address the issues, the diverse recognition networks, it's important to really use multiple examples, different examples, and maybe that was just one example that people could use to sort of highlight a particular phenomenon, which is the spread of cholera in the 1800s in a particular location. to highlight critical features. And in the example that I provided, the critical feature really was the sort of the look of where these cases were occurring. And in many cases, these individuals who were exposed actually died within 24 hours. It's a very, very serious condition. And if it's not treated immediately, people will die from that. At the time, there wasn't really much that could be done. And so by highlighting the critical features, which is the spread of the disease, where was it concentrated? It's easier to understand that rather than just using text. And providing multiple media and formats. So we could use text, but we could also use a image, which was what we did. We could also use a video or a movie about the story to really enhance that idea too. And one just has to go on to maybe YouTube and then type in Jon Snow. And I'm sure there's a documentary on this particular event. And also to be able to use this material to support background context. Maybe you're using this story of Jon Snow to begin a discussion of different modes of transmission. How is disease, how are pathogens spread from one person or from one organism to another? Okay. All right, so let's, next slide, please. At this point, I want to ask you folks, how would you make your instructional materials appeal to a diverse range of students? How would you do that? Let's see, and you can answer in the chat area. Let's see. I can give you an idea myself. I use screencast. I record what I do on my computer monitor in order to get people, I guess, to provide them instruction on how to do particular things, especially if it's something that they're unfamiliar with. Like if they're in my online course and I want them to work with other individuals in groups, I have to show them how to use the groups, how to get into the groups and work with that. Okay, I see that Todd says to draw content. Absolutely. And in fact, I know of an individual who actually was in the math department who was actually drawing out equations that he would provide. I'm trying to remember what the particular concept he was trying to communicate, but it was a concept that every semester he would be teaching, and students would always come to him during office hours, or sometimes they'd interrupt in a class after it had been taught several sessions before, and he'd have to spend time sort of describing that. Again, and of course, we have information that we want to sort of get out in each session, and sometimes we don't have time for that. So what he did is to create a screencast or recording, and what he said was after he did that, the number of questions on that particular subject dropped dramatically. Very rarely was he asked in class after he had presented to come up and repeat it again because people had access to it. Let's see. Yvonne says to provide examples from multiple disciplines or context. Nancy says make 3D models of complex concepts. Thank you so much, Nancy. And Damien, reading guides for primary sources. All excellent examples. Thank you so much. Next slide. All right. So let's talk about how we might do that. All of these suggestions. We might use text. We might use images, audio, video, maybe even use audio description, which is kind of like captions, but actually it's much more encompassing than just captions. Or transcripts for any video or audio. Or even what we're doing right now, which is web conferencing. So I'm going to talk about a few of these things as we go on. Next slide. Now, I want to emphasize that we need to be continually adjusting to meet learner needs. And so it's not just that once you've made this change, that's it. I don't need to advance it. Every semester when I am teaching, I teach in the fall semesters, I try to include or add something that enhances what I do a little bit more. So you don't have to do it all at once, but there's still a commitment to making continual improvements. Like anything else we do with our content, with our own research, we want to make it better and better. So we want to include our students, all the students, within a collaborative environment. So students who may have a hearing disability, absolutely, you want to make sure that you make the content available so that it's available to them, and then students who have a maybe who are in a situation where English is their second language, or they're trying to learn a science, they may require more transcripts or more text for them to be able to review. Okay. Next slide, please. So I just want to go over very quickly this idea of multiple means of representation. So what we're doing is we're asking individuals to adjust the activity of the task in their courses. So, offer alternative forms of information using diagrams, using photographs and storyboards, and multimedia. And I mentioned in the previous slide, text and audio. And when you combine them, they become multimedia and they become more powerful. For content presented in digital text, one might consider tools such as text-to-speech to minimize cognitive demand on decoding, especially for students that have a learning disability such as dyslexia. Also, you might want to support learners to cope with challenges within the activities or the tasks. So you might want to introduce information progressively with temporary assistive components, or scaffolding. That's where you provide a little bit of information and you build on it the next time you come back to it, and build on it the next time you come after that, in order to help students to manage the content at a reasonable pace. And some people require more time in learning something. And so if you have something which is recorded, you don't have to worry about students who are, desperately trying to take notes and just are not capable of or able to do that to the same degree as some of the other students. Next slide. So let's look at these specific areas like text. All right. Now, text is widely used in higher education and in course material, and it's often the primary medium for students to access content. For many learners, text is an efficient medium of obtaining information, but when it's well structured and accessible. But regarding printed text, many students are good at accessing text and deriving meaning from it. However, those who have difficulty may be labeled as learning disabled. So text, in using it, really should provide support for understanding and should engage learners with language that is appropriate to the learning context. And so let me give you some ideas. Next slide. You might want to use text to list objectives to support learners in identifying the purpose of the text. What are we talking about today? Why is it important? What am I expected to learn from this? So you want to use language that's understandable, that's appropriate, and engaging for the learner. Obviously, and I am stating the obvious, is that for courses which are introductory, and I've taught introduction to public health, I want to make sure that my professional jargon is somewhat introduced gradually. I'm not going to just jump right into it. Now, of course, that wouldn't be the case for advanced students, upper division students, or graduate students. So what I'm saying is that it has to be appropriate for the student population. I might also need to choose font styles that are easy to read and do not distract from the content. So sans serif versus serif, or serif. Maybe I might want to look at the layout of the text. It's important to enhance comprehension so that learners can follow a pattern and really make meaningful connections. And so how I present my information, even whether it's face-to-face or and probably even more so in an online environment, it needs to make sense for the students. So I would not put all of my content in let's say a content area or a session or a weekly or a module area, because I want to make sure that the material that I present in week 1 is distinguished and separated from material in week 2, week 3, week 4. Okay. Let's see. I want to be sure to include table of contents, page numbers, information on units, chapters, and sections within a text, which is also very important to understand that. Now, for some individuals who are native speakers, that might not be an issue, especially if they're long time. They were brought up using the methodology that we use in this particular culture. But don't make the assumption that that's going to be the case with all of your students. I want to make a special shout out here to the use of text and an image. Now, sometimes we have text in an image, and I'll have an example in a minute. which actually is inappropriate. The text actually is in the image, and for individuals who use screen readers, they will not be able to discern what that image is. So you might want to use the alt text, alternative text, to assist that. Next slide. Audio. Okay, it's one of my favorite sessions. Audio. Next slide. So audio-based materials really can offer students an alternative way of receiving content. For example, a student may use an audiobook version or a text, or listen to text-to-speech as they read a journal article. Okay. So audio-based materials can also be the primary medium for content. Alternatively, audio content really needs to be accompanied by a transcript. So now we're coming back to our text item is also very important. Next slide. Let me give you an example from my own class of how I use audio. And it also, you can see right now that there is an accompanying transcript. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a, okay. I'm going to play a weekly greeting for my students. Weekly greeting, session 12. Greetings and welcome to session 12. There are a number of issues that I'd like to clear up before discussing the topic for session 12. First, I want to reiterate what I said last week. Okay, all right, that's enough of that. So every week, because I have an online class and I don't meet with my students face to face, I really want to make a connection with the students. And so I'll have a weekly greeting in which I talk about what we're going to be speaking about in a particular week. So I'll give them, what the objectives are for that week, where the readings are, and where they can find the lecture, the voice recorded, self-running, narrated lecture. Okay, I also include, as I mentioned earlier, I also include a transcript, and this is for individual. And I've done this for a long time, even before I know about UDL. But this is also very important for students to be able to come back and look at that. And it also is good for me when I'm going through it, when I'm reading it, so I stay on task, and nothing is missing. All right. You can see that I have a play button here, and of course it just allows people to play it and then go back and repeat if they really need to. How loud they want to hear it, a lot of different things like that. So it really provides an opportunity for us, for my students and myself, to be able to connect and make explicit what they need to know. Okay. Now, in another example, a faculty member might compile maybe a number of interesting podcasts that they're intending to use to introduce a topic in their field and to ultimately promote classroom discussion. There are a plethora of podcasts, and I'm sure there are podcasts in anyone's particular content area, whether it's music or public health or physics, to be able to get that information and identify what particular episode is relevant to what you may be talking about for a particular week, okay, or a session. So next slide, please. What are some other examples of using audio? Now, I think we're getting close to our time here. I'm concerned about finishing on time. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump right into examples. Next slide. I use Adobe Presenter. I've also used Articulate Presenter or even Office Mix to record a PowerPoint slide presentation. Okay, so I'll record a slide and pair it with, record a lecture and pair it with the slides. I can also record an explanation of a complex diagram or relationship in my own words for students to review. I can create a series of short audio pieces to introduce or connected topics throughout the course. Okay, and I can also share hints or tips or step-by-step instructions. So I can actually use this I can also provide feedback on assignment, which is really interesting. Sometimes I'll just leave feedback for the students so they can listen to my comments. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. Images. All right, images, another big media that can be incorporated. Next slide. The reason for that is that our brains decode visual information much faster than text. So images can support narrative and expository content, and they can also show dynamic processes, relationships, computations, and procedures. So images can successfully convey complex information, enhance understanding, and improve retention. Um, Images can also engage students more effectively than text. Next slide. Now, images should include text alternatives. Multimedia should include captions or transcripts, and learners should be able to adjust the appearance or the rate of presentation, since not all learners can process information at the same speed. So we're talking about using images as an alternative to text, audio, video, or they can be used in addition to these other media types. Obviously, when talking about recording lectures, we're combining visual imagery, text, and audio. All right, next slide. Okay, now that's it. Go back, please. Thanks, Yvonne. So many concepts are communicated more effectively with the addition of illustrations, as I had mentioned before. This particular infographic actually shows a sort of ideas, percentages of how common mobile use is in higher education. So we can see right here that 80% of the time is spent with students on apps. Only 20% is using web browsers. And we can see that we look at other examples, number of mobile phones by country. I think it was astounding to find out that China has by far much more cell phones, and India, than the United States and many other countries. So we get an idea for how the technology, or what technology is being used in different nations. Okay, next slide. Actually, I want to, the point here, right here, is although you have text incorporated in an image, it's important really to make sure that the images are accessible. So in this particular case, if you have to have text in an image, you want to make sure that it's represented in an accessible way. Okay. You also want to make sure that you follow copyright and attribution guidelines. You'll notice right here that I've got the name of the person who created this particular image. So whenever you do that, make sure that you do that. And you can do that using Creative Commons, like in Flickr, which is what I use for a lot of my own images. Okay, let's go. Next slide. Video, next slide. All right, so both instructor use of video and student-generated video, they can be used to recruit and sustain interest for particular topics. They can lead to more meaningful participation in the classroom, and you can use it for a lot of different reasons. You can walk through a problem set for students to watch at any time, and that's the example that I gave earlier with the math professor. You can use screen capture to walk through students through materials in the course website, and that's how I use it primarily myself. I'll have, and this, in fact, what you're seeing right here is sort of an example, an introduction for students on how to use the web conferencing tool. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to jump to, okay, going to jump to, let's see, this is web conferencing, which is what we're doing right here. Just wanted to mention that web conferencing is also an effective tool because we combine a lot of different things, including sharing information, web chat, breakout rooms, sharing video. There's a lot of different things that you can do in the web conferencing. All right, I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to, let's see, going to ask are there any questions about multiple uses or means of representation? What we did is we talked about the different aspects of UDL principles, and we focused on multiple means of representation. And we also provided tips and recommendations for individuals who are interested in implementing UDL in their own courses. And at this point, I'd like to ask, are there any questions? Okay. All right. So I don't see any questions being asked right now, so I'm just going to refer to the resources that I used: Center for Applied Special Technology, or CAST, the National Center on Universal Design for Learning, and there's the the URL for that. And then finally, there's a new resource that NIU has available for everyone, lynda.com. If you're part of the university system, part of this university faculty, staff, or students, you can have access to all of the content that is in lynda.com. The one that I used was Foundations for Teaching with Technology, Applying Universal Design for Learning with Technology. It was an excellent resource. All right. Are there any questions? Okay, I think we've gone right up to our time. I want to thank you all for participating. You're welcome, Nancy and Leslie and Damien. Great. Well, I want to remind you all that we have a second session, or a third session, in April, which looks at multiple means of action and expression. So I invite you to consider coming to that one as well. The link or the recording for this will be available probably by tomorrow, and I will send out a follow-up email to all of you who participated in today's session. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great day.